And then you get a different perspective again, and people are interested. You sort of feel like you're not just there to learn, but interviewing and field work becomes more of an exchange. And that's really exciting. That's really wonderful. But again, it's at the start. It's about being patient.
This is Southeast Asia from the ground up. I'm your host Emir, and I'm here with Dr. Eve Warburton. Hi Eve, how are you?
I'm well, Emir. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Eve is a research fellow at the Department of Political and Social Change, and she is also the director of ANU's Indonesia's Institute. I'm quite excited to talk to you today because we are going to talk about something that I'm quite passionate about, which is doing field work and being in the field, and discussing how much being in the field will influence the way we think and the way we write, right? So I would like to start with that. I would like to start with your first book manuscript, which is Resource Nationalism in Indonesia, published with Cornell 2023, which I thought quite interesting because your puzzle is a very grounded work. It's a very fieldwork-based work. And I want to start with the Indonesian puzzle, you call it, right? Which is quite, Indonesian puzzle, where you lay out these two key puzzles of persistence, of resource nationalism, and unevenness of nationalist interventions. So how much was this puzzle conceptualized before fieldwork? And how much was it changed or evolved, maybe not change, after fieldwork?
Yeah, great. So this was all based on my doctoral dissertation research. And the first one puzzle was sort of conceptualized as part of developing my research proposal. So before I went to the field, and that was trying to understand variation in economic nationalism and nationalist interventions across different resource sectors. So I could already see patterns, uneven patterns of nationalist intervention from mining to oil and gas and to palm oil as well. Those are the three sectors the book focuses on. So that was sort of already conceptualized. But the puzzle that, in fact, in some ways sort of, I guess, spoke to a broader literature more directly, that sort of emerged. The puzzle about why do we find in Indonesia this sort of persistence or even strengthening of resource nationalism after a commodity boom, because so much of the international literature at the time, around 2012, 2013, it was still sort of, I guess, dominated by this theory or this understanding that resource nationalism is really tied to commodity boom cycles. So prices go up, you get more nationalism. And when prices go down, when, states are sort of, hungry for more revenue, for more funds, they will, the nationalist sort of impulse will fade away, and you will get states sort of opening up and liberalizing their resource sectors again, seeking more foreign investment. So that was sort of the dominant theory at the time. But while I was in the field, this was right after the commodity boom, so 2014, 2015, 2016, and what I saw was more and more nationalism in some sectors. So that puzzle sort of emerged while I was in the field, while I was, engaged in sort of deep conversations with policymakers who were responsible for these sorts of interventions, or at least for designing and implementing them. So so one puzzle pre-field work, and one puzzle sort of emerged at the time and through field work.
Interesting. And what was interesting as well, when in the opening of your book, you laid out quite nicely the experience during your fieldwork, right? Like where people were telling you different things from your finding, in a way. Like, Indonesia's not Indonesia needs foreigners,
Right.
and this is just gonna be blow over. Did you believe them? And when you hear that in the
Right.
beginning, and when did you start revising your thoughts?
So I think that, yeah, so there was, this assumption that resource nationalism will simply fade away or weaken once commodity prices weaken. That assumption really guided people's understandings and explanations for resource nationalism, not just scholars, but people who were in Indonesia, foreign investors themselves, foreign media, foreign governments. It was quite a dominant sort of assumption. And so when I sort of arrived in Indonesia to do my fieldwork in 2013, 2014, that's what people were telling me. And so they said, well, yes, variation across sectors, I guess that's interesting, but, just be aware that this could all blow over pretty quickly. And I think that I already had a sense that it might not, because the people who held those assumptions weren't necessarily talking to the people I was talking to or who I wanted to talk to. So particular types of policymakers, policymakers who also had business interests or were very close to domestic business interests in these sectors. And so I was hearing very different kinds of stories, narratives, perspectives from people in the Indonesian government and business community who I think these other sorts of stakeholders, often foreign stakeholders in Indonesia, they weren't necessarily talking to those same people. I also think that people's prior experiences continued to really shape their understanding of the dynamics of resource nationalism at that time in sort of the mid-2000s. They were really guided by the things they already knew, and I think weren't necessarily open to noticing the changes that were going on in the domestic business sector and policy-making circles. And because I guess I was new to it all, and I was open to these other possibilities of the trajectory that resource nationalism might take, I already felt sort of somewhat confident that there was something really interesting here and something worth investigating and writing about.
Wow. I would like to explore that a little bit further later, because that's very interesting, right? Like, how do you filter information you gain from the field, from these different people, right? And making sure that they're balanced. But before that, I want to kind of like circle back to how you plan your field work, right? This was in 2013.
2013, 2014, 2015, 2016.
And
on and off those years.
Yes. And so walk us through that process of planning your field work, right? Do you plan for delays? Do you think about relationship buildings and informal interactions? Was that your first experience being in the field? So walk us through the initial process of your field work when you think about it as well.
Sure. So I think for this particular book, because the original sort of tranche of field work was done as part of my doctoral work, I had the privilege of spending years on one project. And doing a PhD is a real privilege. You get time that you wouldn't normally get to plan, to execute, to revise, to plan, to execute the fieldwork, over a period of several years. So I think in the first instance, when I arrived in the field, I had experience working in Indonesia, doing some research in Indonesia, but I didn't have experience in these particular sectors necessarily. So it was a lot of planning, but also a lot of patience was required. So I spent a whole year in Indonesia, and it started slow. And I think this kind of fieldwork where your goal is really to get a really deep understanding of processes of policy making on the ground, you need to speak to lots and lots of different people who are involved in this process in different ways. And to speak to a large number of people, senior policymakers, politicians who I've never met before, who don't know who I am, I understood at the time, well, looking back, I say I understood at the time. I was probably more impatient than I'm recalling, but I knew that I had to be patient. So, it was really a process in those first sort of 3 to 4 months of calling everyone I could, getting the contacts and then calling and SMSing and emailing everyone I could who was working in this space, and just seeing who responded.
Yeah.
Depending on the generosity of other people, really, in the first instance. And, this is a process of years. And, I was fortunate enough to have met many generous people who took me under their wing, explained the sectors, introduced me to people, and then, the snowball method that we all know very well, if you were doing qualitative social science work, that really, it's a slow moving snowball.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what happens when you're doing this kind of work when you're a doctoral student.
Yeah.
The book was only published last year, and the research really kept going, and I sort of went back and forth to sort of complete parts of the book up until about 2019, 2020. And then it's interesting going back once you've graduated, once you had a few publications under your belt, what you find is that people are more interested in talking to you, or that was my experience. Some people kind of had read a little bit of what I'd done or had heard of me, or I went back to people who I'd, interviewed years earlier. And then you get a different perspective again, and people are interested, you sort of feel like you're not just there to learn, but interviewing and Fieldwork becomes more of an exchange.
Yeah.
And that's really exciting. That's really wonderful. But again, it's at the start, it's about being patient and being humble, and knowing that there's going to be many, many days, weeks, if not months, where you're not getting to the people that you hope to get to, but that you're getting to others, other sorts of stakeholders, and eventually these doors will open if you are patient and persistent.
Yeah, and I think that's also quite important, especially in Southeast Asia, where it's quite hierarchical.
Right.
And they also quite, relying quite a lot on trust, right?
Right.
Unless you have a connections to the top, and then you can just work your way to the bottom.
Right.
It's almost like you need to make sure that you build relationship around this person.
That's right.
And then the snowballing, it's not just a snowballing, but it's kind of like a process getting to where you wanted to be, right? But what was the experience like in the beginning? And did that change over time as you've built more and more relationships throughout this project, at least?
Yes, I think absolutely. You sort of you snowball, but it's sort of like you're forming a sort of not concentric circles, but almost like a maze where you're kind of getting slowly closer to the center and solving the problem, or a reverse maze, if you like, getting closer and closer to the center. And I think that, that's right. When you come in and you're, facing a new topic, a new field, a new community of people that you're trying to access and to gain the trust of, then, as I said, you have to be really patient and cast your net really wide when you're looking for informants or respondents, people who will be willing to speak to you. And I think one of the most important things is that you can build rapport with people, so with all people that you're speaking with, so that you can generate some kind of reputation where people are interested in meeting with you, and that they will tell others and recommend you to others and open doors for you. Now, there's no sort of magic trick for how you build trust and rapport. I think it's really first and foremost about being yourself and being very direct with your respondents about what your goals are, that you're an academic, this is a scholarly project. And I think actually the trust comes from emphasizing your objectivity. Of course, we all bring our own biases into the field. But I think emphasizing that as scholars, we are at least seeking to be objective when we analyze the problems that we're analyzing that involve the stakeholders we're interviewing. And I think not all stakeholders or interviewees or respondents, whatever you want to term them, not all of them will respond positively to your status as an outsider, as an academic, but some will really value it. And they will value that you are direct and honest about your position and what you're seeking in your project. And I think that sharing with people your ideas, your research, the direction your research is taking, how it might be useful to the people that you're interviewing, I think and making it more of an exchange. I think to me, that's how I learned that was a process that could build trust, build long-lasting relationships, and that it would help me to sort of expand my networks as well. If you're seen as someone who's generous, you're not just there to kind of extract information, but you're there to share information. because especially once you've done your PhD, going back to the field becomes a bit easier because people will see you more as an expert.
Yeah.
I mean, there's two different ways of looking at it. When you're a PhD student, I think especially in Indonesia, people want to help. Actually, a lot of people want to help you.
Yeah.
They want to take you under their wing, and they're interested in you and what you're doing, and they're kind. Not everyone, but that was my general feeling. But then once you've got your PhD and you're doing field work under different circumstances, you're sort of seen as someone who might have expertise and information and knowledge that is worth sharing with your informants, your respondents, the people that you're talking to. And so I think that's sort of, it's a long-winded answer, but I think this is what matters when it comes to building trust with people who we don't know on a personal level.
No, I think I'm constantly surprised by how generous people can be with their time, and how, especially in Indonesia, where they're quite paternal. They kind of look at me and they're like, "Oh, let me fill you up with all these information." But then they're also quite generous with their time because they want to be heard.
Yes, exactly.
And they want to kind of like share their informations and have their views being represented. And I think you raised quite good questions as well. Good answer as well with regards to, like, it's an exchange. They also want to get out from their work and have some sort of perspective.
That's right.
Sharing, right? And does that play quite important role, like this exchange in persuading your informants or to kind of like come to you?
I think that if the interviews are interesting to the people that you're interviewing, they're more likely to kind of feel relaxed, stick around, answer more questions, take more time with you, or meet you again. So I think, and it's not that we don't always know exactly how to make our interviews interesting, but what I've often found is, and I do a lot of elite interviews, as well as elites in terms of both politicians, business people, but also prominent academics, activists rather as well, and NGO activists. So sort of people who have been working in their area for a long time and who are experts in what they do, but they don't always get to stop, step, and think about the broader picture of what they're working on or in. And sometimes they enjoy being asked sort of more intellectually challenging questions, or they're interested, in the perspective of a political scientist who might be reading things about things going on in other parts of the world, who might have a different sort of a different perspective based on different sorts of information that they're not either accessing or considering, and bringing that sort of scholarly / analytical perspective to the work they're doing can be really interesting for them.
Yes, definitely.
So, I mean, it's not that I sit there and lecture them, far from it. But I think that what I've learned over the years is that, sort of approaching your interviews, not just in terms of what I want to get out of this person, but what is also interesting for this person who I want to meet, and what perspective can I bring, and what kind of information can I share that might make this a much more sort of fruitful exchange for the both of us.
When you think about how people perceive you, right, there are things that we can change and plan and prepare, like the way we ask questions, what our questions and things like that, but there are things that we can't change, right? The color of our skin,
right,
our identities, the fact that, say, we are educated from Australian National University, for example. All this carries some sort of identities and shape the way people interact with us, and quite a lot of time we can't change that, right? We can't suddenly become someone else. But how do you leverage, manage, or I don't know how sometimes, because that it can be a positive thing, it can be a negative thing, right? But how does how your background and identities shape and affect the way you do field work?
I mean, as a woman researching politics in Indonesia, where there's sort of generally an underrepresentation of women in politics in Indonesia, but then also, especially for that book, looking particularly at The extractive industries, again, sort of dominated by men, both in terms of the bureaucracy that's responsible for overseeing these sectors, but also in terms of the business people who are involved. And in the regions, I went to the regions as well as part of my research. So Sulawesi, Kalimantan, again, these industries and the political institutions too are very dominated by men. So I think I was very aware of both being foreign, but also being a woman. Yeah. Very aware of my gender identity. And I think, yes, sometimes it worked to my advantage, and sometimes I did feel it was a disadvantage. So I think the advantage is that people are curious about you. They're curious because, well, at that time, I was a foreigner, I was young, and I was a woman. And so curiosity definitely can work in my favor. People sort of, I think, said yes to my requests for interviews. Yeah. And I know this for a fact because I had a friend who was doing something similar, and he was a more senior male academic, and I actually got more interviews than him, and I think it was pure curiosity on the part of the interviewees. Who is this person? What is she doing here? And so that's great. I think that for a woman, though, you do sort of, the challenge is the way men see you, and the extent that they take you seriously. Do they take you intellectually seriously? I think as a PhD student, I was very anxious about that, a lot of the time. There's also a barrier, I think, to, especially when you're studying politics and political campaigns in Indonesia. When I was, a junior female academic, a lot of the campaigns go on late at night. There's very few women around. Sometimes they go to 2 or 3 in the morning. Sometimes they go to karaoke bars, things like this. So places where I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable at that time. So, I just sort of had to just not attend some of these sorts of events in which, my young male counterparts would have happily attended, just due to feeling comfortable. But I think that overall it worked to my advantage. And now as I've become, more experienced and I'm more senior, I feel much more confident that people take me seriously. They probably always did. It may be my own anxieties and the degree to which I was just self-conscious. But I think that the advantage is that particularly elites who were sort of embedded in sort of deep personal networks in the work that they do, where there is a lot of internal kind of competition as well and fragmentation, they often enjoy the opportunity to speak to someone from outside that world, who's so far outside of that world in a sense, or at least from their perspective, that they feel they can open up and talk about things and seek a new perspective in ways that they often can't on a day-to-day basis. I think also the fact that when you're doing elite research in a place like Indonesia, where there's always a concern about, sort of information being leaked to the press or social media, talking to an academic who is not interested in sort of sound bites or an immediate response and publishing something, just, speaking to a foreign scholar, I think for some elites is actually something they really enjoy doing. It's an opportunity for them. And so to that extent, I think it works in my favor. And I'm aware when I do my collaborative work with academic partners in Indonesia, they will often talk about that they think that sometimes it's harder for them to get, the real answers perhaps from their informants, their elite informants, than it might be for a foreigner. I think having said that, the fact that as foreigners we just have to fly in, fly out, that there's a real disadvantage to that. The really deep qualitative work that I like doing, that I love, I enjoy doing, that really sort of stimulates me, you get so much more when you're in the field long term, when you can meet with people again and again, when they see your face at events, when they trust that you're kind of part of part of this network, that you're in it for the long term. So I think the big disadvantage of being an outsider and being a foreigner, being based outside of a country that you work on or countries that you work on, is just that perception of you as someone who flies in and flies out, and that perhaps, and you have to work hard to overcome this perception of as someone who's coming in to exploit and extract and take information, publish it. You have to build relationships with your informants and also build relationships and partnerships with colleagues and like research partners. And so that people can kind of, really see that you are invested long term in the sector, the area, the arena, the community, whatever it is that you're researching.
Yeah, and I think with my experience, which is a slightly bizarre experience because I'm Indonesian, but I am speaking mostly to my family, not in Bahasa, but in our local language like Malay. And then I've been overseas for quite a long time. So I speak mainly English with my friends. So somehow my Bahasa is kind of like 10 years ago Bahasa. And and
Maybe your accent sounds a little Australian.
and therefore people will be like, are you Singaporean or are you
Malaysian or
or are you like have you been living overseas for long? They started like othering me straight away,
right?
And obviously when I talked to my mom, I was like, I'm not like weird sounding, right, Mom? And she was like, no, you're not weird sounding, you sound fine, because I've talked to my family regularly. So with that, even as an Indonesian, I need to kind of like introduce myself over and over and gain their trust, and be kind of like offer them comfort and be part of their inner circle and trust. But quite a lot of time, my experience as a male Indonesian, young male Indonesians, they like to kind of like father me as well, like like let me fill you with, like I'm an empty cup. But with that, there's quite a lot of advantage and disadvantage, because the advantage is they're so willing to share,
right?
Even overshare
the information you might not need.
But sometimes they also want me to think in a certain way,
right?
Because at the end of the day, they want to shape me and mold me into thinking and writing in a certain way. And when I'm not, and when I challenge them during that hierarchy, that father and son dynamic, they expect that as well, right? I can't challenge them as much during the interview, otherwise they would be kind of like start getting guarded. So have you, with your experience, have you noticed participants started behaving differently around you because perhaps the way you speak, or maybe that's why you invest so much on learning Bahasa, right? But, I think what's your experience on that?
So I do speak Bahasa, and I think, and yes, I probably should have raised this before, because that immediately changes how respondents, the people I speak to, how they see me, and how they value me as well. I think many of the people that I speak to, policymakers, business people, they would be interacting all the time with foreigners. Actually, well, not all the time, but many of them would have somewhat regular interactions with foreign investors, foreign diplomats and the like. But the fact that I have spent so many years investing in my Bahasa, I think they already sort of feel a level of excitement, interest, again, curiosity, but I think they're also appreciative of the extent to which, I've sort of invested in learning Bahasa to a degree where I can conduct sophisticated interviews. And I think that gives me an advantage. I mean, we're talking about sort of advantages and disadvantages of being a foreigner, but it also gives me an advantage over other foreigners conducting this sort of research, I think. I really sort of can't emphasize that enough, that you get a very different quality of interview when you're doing it in Bahasa, in the mother tongue of the country in which you're doing your work. And of course, it's not always possible, obviously. And I'm not as fluent as other colleagues we have here at the ANU, that's for sure. But I think in Indonesia in particular, it's a place where people are extraordinarily, generous, I think, in their willingness to meet you and to speak with you, but they're also really generous in terms of their patience with your language skills and your level of language skills. So, I do speak Bahasa, I do all my interviews in Bahasa, but I still make mistakes. Sometimes I stumble, and I think people are so appreciative of the effort that I make, that they sort of ignore my mistakes or help me or whatever it may be. But I think, and again, I think the hierarchy issue that you raise, this is the other advantage of being a foreigner, is that you're not judged or kind of brought into the hierarchy in the same way that you are if you're an Indonesian researcher conducting research in Indonesia. And I guess that's another advantage that I'm aware of.
Yes, and I think the difficulty, if you don't know the context, know the language, is things lost in translations as well, right?
Yes.
They're very generous. Like Indonesia tends to be very generous at expressing themselves, sharing, but then whether or not they can share it's not about like language necessarily, but it's just about expression.
And metaphor. I mean, metaphor is something
metaphor.
that can be really difficult to make sure you've understood.
Yeah.
I have sometimes I have to sort of, metaphors that people use in Bahasa, especially they're speaking quickly. I have to stop them and say, explain that again and make sure, did I understand this correctly? Is this the metaphor that you're using? Does the metaphor mean this? So there are certainly times where I have to, stop, confirm, repeat, go back and ask others if I understood it correctly. Yeah. So there's all these complications and nuances in conducting deep research in a different language that you do miss things, of course, and you have to be really careful. I always, if I am going to quote someone in my book or an article or something, obviously all of that, the ethics research agreement that the ethics committee permission that we get, the permit, that was the word I was looking for, covers us, right? But you have to always make sure that you've understood someone in the way that they intended you to understand them, and seek permission before using a quote, especially when you're researching in a different language, in a second language.
No, I think that's really, really true, especially when quite a lot in the field in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia, their answer is quite a lot of, well, if you know, wink, wink, and then move on to that. But you've touched about this briefly earlier, which is about making sure, you have this balance, people you're interviewing from different, political parties, representations, and things like that. But what is your approach to that generally when choosing who to interview? Are you aware of whose voices are being included and who's being left out?
Yes, of course. I think that gets to the core of objectivity. You, as a researcher, if I'm focused on a particular policy outcome or a particular piece of legislation that's being debated or something like that, or a particular case or a controversy, it's extraordinarily important to be able to speak to very different sorts of stakeholders who have experienced a particular case differently, who have a different set of biases or interests, or bringing a different set of interests to bear on a particular case or piece of legislation. And you really do have to try and get the entire picture.
Yeah.
That's the thing that's at the core of what we do. And then, it's not just about sort of weighing up different people's opinions. It's about sort of then bringing that back to your core research question and to the broader sort of literature that you're engaging with. And you can't really speak to that literature if you've in a really sort of analytically sound way, unless you are confident that you have truly captured, I guess, the sort of kaleidoscope of perspectives and voices that are being brought to bear to a particular case or policy or whatever it is that you're researching. And how, again, I know that this answer is always like, oh, it depends, but how do you know or decide that, okay, I have enough for this research, I have enough perspectives for this? Or like in your experience, right, like when people are telling you about, things will blow over, right,
people this is just a momentary thing, this resource nationalism trend, how do you know that I want to keep interviewing people until
you can interview people forever. It's always so fascinating. You'll always get different nuances and people will kind of but what stops you is that you need to finish the book or finish the article or finish it is what you're doing. I think that there's no, there is no, it depends.
Yeah.
It really does depend. And it depends entirely on what it is that you're trying to achieve through your fieldwork and through the interview process. I think that you need to speak to a sort of, a number of people from each side to the point where you feel confident that you can characterize their position and the reasons for their position confidently and accurately. And, you know, I think also we're social scientists, you know, we're not medical scientists. We're not mathematicians. You know, everything we do is to a degree interpretive. And I think that that's just the big caveat that we work with, and the way we write about our subjects, the way we write about the people who we interview. I think we have to build in, you know, that, I guess, caveat in a way, right? And be very humble about the conclusions that we're drawing and the predictions that we're making based on our field work. That's the best you can do, I think, as a social scientist. But you just have to do the field work and feel as though you have done enough, and that you can convince yourself and others that you have understood and captured the position and the perspective of a particular group of people or a particular group of stakeholders accurately.
Yeah, definitely. And do you believe on objectivity? Is that a thing? And how do you build? Because one of the difficulty is that the more I go to the field, the more I build rapport, trust, relationships, right? But then I also want to make sure that these people remain trusting of me, and I took care of their this relationship, but without losing my ability to write authoritatively, even when they would be perhaps upset with what I would write in that way, right? But it is always like a difficult balance. But in your experience, how do you build this trust and relationship and protect your informant without losing that ability to write authoritatively and without losing objectivity
and to criticize
right,
to be critical? That's right. We need to be critical. I mean, it is and it isn't a balancing act. I mean, I think that it can be an uncomfortable situation to be in when the people who you have spent time with, listening to, speaking to, when you sort of fundamentally, perhaps, you fundamentally either disagree with their perspective, or when it comes time to writing up your findings, you take a very critical position that perhaps they wouldn't agree with, or feel paints them or their institution in an unflattering light or some such. I mean, this is the kind of work we do. This is something that we grapple with all the time. What I've learnt is that when you strive for objectivity and you present yourself as a serious scholar, and you are very upfront with your informants and interviewees about the goals of your research, your objectivity, and I think most people understand that. That's why they would value talking to you as a scholar. Then they either will understand the positions that you take and the way you write. B, they may not even read it. But let's be honest, because they're not that interested. They're interested in talking, but they might not be interested in reading everything you do. Or three, you might just have to live and be comfortable with the fact that people might not like what you write. The people you might not like what you write, and they may not be comfortable speaking to you again in the future. And that's a price that we have to pay, because ultimately everything that what we write, what we produce as scholars, it needs to strive for, we're not always objective, but we need to strive for objectivity. And the worst thing would be for us to dampen our critique, or to be less critical in the work that we do, because we are worried about relationships in the field. That's sort of something that we can't entertain, I think, as scholars. But overall, I think it's really about, fostering relationships with stakeholders in a way that, emphasizes to them that you are a scholar, and that everything you do will necessarily be critical and will strive for objectivity. And that means that they will be treated with respect. That all of the sort of ethical guidelines that we work under, and they will respect that and value that as well, will be adhered to. And that in itself, should lead our informants to both kind of understand our work and to respect that, I think, in the end. And if you lose some informants because of the critical nature of your work, then sudahlah. That's just the way, it's just the way it works. But I mean, interestingly, I have never found that. I have just I think most people I speak to don't read my work in any real detail. But also I think that they understand that that's my job. Right? And they value hearing other perspectives, and they value the critical position that we often take. And sometimes they enjoy debating me on this. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you know, as long as you believe in your words, right, and you've done all this due diligence, the best you can to represent it, that I find that, you know, that's fine. I've had this experience where someone quite higher up called my boss because he was upset with my writing and asked me to kind of like retract that. And then my boss was like, well, no, I'm not gonna do that because... And then he did ask me whether, you know, like, is that okay? And I was like, yeah, I believe in my word. And at the end of the day, that's that for that episode. And I think that comes to this point about writing, right? Like, which is a very tricky point because, like you said, when our work is inherently interpretations and interpretive sometimes, there's always many sides to the truths, and it's very difficult to kind of like pin down truths. But when writing, how do you avoid, you know, reinforcing stereotypes or misrepresenting the communities you are studying? Are you very conscious about that in general?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think my work adheres to stereotypes. I mean, if anything, I think as scholars, we usually get into this industry because we aren't satisfied with superficial characterizations of phenomena, including stereotypes of people or communities, or just superficial renderings of what are really complex social problems. And so I think, you know, I mean, the example with my book is that I wasn't satisfied with this sort of assumption that a country's nationalist impulses in the resource sectors was something that was simply just either tethered to external commodity prices or could be explained away as the actions of sort of corrupt or myopic, you know, bureaucrats. I just wasn't convinced by that based on sort of the deep work I was doing. And so I think that, you know, our job as scholars is to interrogate oversimplified or superficial characterizations of people and phenomena. And so I think that that's what I take to the field, you know, every day. And that's why I love fieldwork, because it breaks down, you know, those sorts of stereotypes.
Definitely. And that dissatisfaction was a very good point, because we are sometimes going to the field from that lens of, we want to address theoretical gap, right? And so this is going to be my last question. But okay, you've done your field work. You're sitting on top of mounting data and information. How, in your experience at least, how did you marshal that insights and informations to contribute to, you know, intervene with the debate in the literature?
Oh, the $1 million question. How do we make contributions to the literature? I mean, I think it's an iterative process. You know, you sort of need to really bury yourself in your data, really get to know every corner of the data that you have, you know, accumulated, and, you know, analyze it from different perspectives. But I think when I say iterative, I also mean that while you're kind of reading through and reflecting on your field work results and your interview transcripts and your data, you should also be rereading the literature that you were reading when you first set out to develop your research questions. You should sort of be reading them and sort of thinking of them as being in conversation with each other. And that's really the best sort of advice that I can offer, because everyone does this differently. And every research project is different as well. You know, I've worked on many more projects since my doctoral dissertation, and, you know, some of them go really smoothly. You know, you sort of have a simple question, you go to the field, you think, yes, that answers it. You know, it's fascinating, and bang, you write it up, and it's extraordinarily, you know, fun and rewarding, and it just happens. And then there are projects where your field results just don't speak back to the research questions in the way you thought they would. And that's difficult. That can be a really hard slog. But I think, I mean, the other piece of advice I would give is that when you go to the field and you're doing your interviews, not only would I cast the net wide in terms of the people that you're approaching and speaking to, I would cast the net wide in terms of the questions you're asking, because sometimes your research questions change and evolve, and the bits of information and little data points and conversations that you thought might not have been directly related to your research question, later on they can emerge as extraordinarily important, and so sort of go in with a very open mind, and with, I guess, we shouldn't go in with a million disparate questions, but my advice would be to just think a little more broadly about what might emerge from your research, because sometimes you don't know precisely what the most valuable bits of information are going to be. And when you sit down and start speaking back to your literature and reading a little bit more and engaging in that iterative process, the things that you thought weren't interesting turn out to be these golden nuggets.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, this is Southeast Asia from the ground up. Thanks so much, Eve.
Thank you, Emir. It's a pleasure.